When historians at the Smithsonian Institution first examined the daguerreotype of Civil War soldier Benjamin Clark, they saw nothing unusual. A proud young man in Union blue, standing tall before his departure to battle. But when digital enhancement technology revealed what lurked in his shadow, the image became one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. The photograph showed not a confident soldier, but a man's body hanging lifeless from a rope, swaying gently in death's embrace. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story begins in 1863, in the small town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, where winter had painted the streets in shades of gray and white. Benjamin Clark walked through the town square with the measured gait of a man carrying the weight of destiny on his shoulders. At 24 years old, he possessed the kind of rugged handsomeness that made mothers smile approvingly and fathers nod with respect. His dark hair was combed back neatly, and his jawline carried the stubble of a man too preoccupied with larger matters to concern himself with daily shaving. The war had been raging for 2 years now, and Millbrook had sent its share of sons to fight for the Union cause. Some had returned home bearing scars and stories of glory, while others came back in pine boxes draped with the stars and stripes. Benjamin had watched his friends march off to war with a mixture of envy and dread, knowing that his time would eventually come. The draft notices had been circulating through town like autumn leaves on the wind, and his name had finally been called. His mother, Margaret Clark, had spent the morning pacing the kitchen floor of their modest 2-story home on Elm Street. She was a woman of 52 years, with graying hair that she kept pinned back in a practical bun, and hands that bore the calluses of decades spent washing clothes and tending to her family. Her husband, Robert, had died 3 years earlier from consumption, leaving her to raise Benjamin and his younger sister, Catherine, alone. The thought of losing her son to the war's hungry maw filled her with a terror that made her chest tight and her breathing shallow. "You don't have to go," she had whispered to him that morning, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire in the hearth. "We could find you work in the textile mills up north. They're always looking for strong backs, and the pay is decent enough." Benjamin had looked at her with those deep brown eyes that reminded her so much of his father. "Ma, you know I can't do that. Every able-bodied man in this town has a duty to serve. I won't be the coward who runs away while others fight for our country." The truth was more complicated than Benjamin let on. He had received a letter 2 weeks earlier that had changed everything. It wasn't from the army or the government, but from a man named Harrison Blackwood, a wealthy merchant from Boston, who claimed to have information about Benjamin's true parentage. The letter suggested that Benjamin wasn't actually the son of Robert Clark, the humble blacksmith, but rather the illegitimate child of a prominent politician whose name Blackwood refused to reveal in writing. The implications were staggering. If Blackwood's claims were true, it meant that Benjamin's entire life had been built on a lie. It meant that the man he had called father, the man whose grave he visited every Sunday after church, was nothing more than a kind stranger who had taken pity on his mother. The letter promised answers, but only if Benjamin could pay the sum of $500 more money than his family had ever seen at one time. The war had presented Benjamin with an opportunity. Military service came with a signing bonus, and if he survived the conflict, he would receive additional compensation and land grants. It was a dangerous gamble, but it might be his only chance to uncover the truth about his origins. The weight of this secret had been crushing him for weeks, making him irritable and distant with his family. Catherine, his 17-year-old sister, had noticed the change in him immediately. She was a perceptive girl with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to see right through people's carefully constructed facades. She had always been closer to Benjamin than anyone else in the world, sharing secrets and dreams that they kept hidden from their mother's worried gaze. "Something's eating at you," she had said to him one evening, as they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the bare branches of the oak trees. "You've been acting strange ever since you got that letter." Benjamin had felt his stomach clench with guilt. Catherine didn't know about Blackwood's letter, and he couldn't bring himself to tell her. The possibility that they might not be full siblings was too painful to contemplate. "I'm just nervous about the war," he had lied, hating himself for the deception. Now, as he walked through the town square toward the photography studio of Marcus Whitmore, Benjamin tried to push these troubled thoughts from his mind. His mother had insisted on commissioning a formal portrait before his departure, a memento that would allow her to remember him as he was before the war changed him, assuming he lived long enough to be changed at all. The studio was located on the second floor of a brick building that also housed a dry goods store and a small law office. Benjamin climbed the narrow wooden stairs, each step creaking under his weight, and found himself standing before a door marked with elegant gold lettering that read, "M. Whitmore, photographic artist." He knocked twice and waited. Marcus Whitmore opened the door with a flourish that suggested he had been expecting this particular visitor. He was a thin man in his 40s, with receding hair and spectacles that seemed perpetually in danger of sliding off his nose. His clothing was impeccable, from his pressed white shirt to his silk vest adorned with a gold pocket watch chain. Photography was still a relatively new profession, and those who practiced it often carried themselves with the air of artists and scientists combined. "Mr. Clark, punctual as always," Whitmore said, stepping aside to allow Benjamin entry into the studio. "I trust you're prepared for what may well be the most important portrait of your life." The studio was unlike anything Benjamin had ever seen. Heavy black curtains blocked out all natural light from the windows, while carefully positioned lamps and reflectors created an artificial illumination that seemed almost magical in its precision. A large camera mounted on a tripod dominated the center of the room, its brass fittings gleaming like jewelry in the lamplight. Bottles of chemicals lined the shelves along the walls, their contents mysterious and slightly threatening to someone unfamiliar with the photographic process. "The daguerreotype process requires absolute stillness," Whitmore explained as he began adjusting his equipment. "Even the slightest movement can blur the image and ruin the entire plate. Some of my subjects find it helpful to think of themselves as statues frozen in time for posterity." Benjamin nodded and began removing his civilian clothes, revealing the Union uniform that his mother had spent the previous evening pressing until every crease was perfect. The blue wool felt heavy against his skin, and the brass buttons caught the lamplight as he fastened them. The uniform transformed him from Benjamin Clark, the blacksmith's son, into Private Clark of the Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, a man ready to march off to war and perhaps to death. As Whitmore prepared his camera, Benjamin found his mind wandering back to Blackwood's letter. The merchant had been specific about certain details that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. He had mentioned a distinctive birthmark on Benjamin's left shoulder, a crescent-shaped mark that Benjamin had always assumed was simply an accident of nature. Blackwood claimed this mark was hereditary, passed down through generations of a prominent New England family. "Now then," Whitmore said, interrupting Benjamin's troubled thoughts, "I want you to stand just here, with your left foot slightly forward. Rest your hand on this table and look directly into the camera. Remember, you must remain absolutely motionless for the entire exposure, which will last approximately 30 seconds. Benjamin positioned himself as instructed, feeling the weight of the moment settling around him like a shroud. This photograph would likely be the last image of him that his family would possess if the worst should happen. He thought of his mother's tearful face that morning, of Catherine's forced smile as she wished him luck, of all the things he might never have the chance to say or do. The studio fell silent except for the soft hissing of the gas lamps. Whitmore disappeared beneath the black cloth that covered his camera, becoming nothing more than a mysterious figure manipulating unseen controls. Benjamin tried to focus on maintaining perfect stillness, but his mind continued to race with troubling thoughts. What if Blackwood was actually telling the truth? What if his entire sense of identity was built on a foundation of lies? The questions gnawed at him like hungry rats, making it difficult to maintain the composed expression that Whitmore had requested. He found himself thinking about his supposed father, Robert Clark, and all the memories they had shared, teaching him to work the forge, showing him how to shape red-hot iron into useful tools, passing down the wisdom of generations of craftsmen. Had it all been an elaborate performance? Had Robert known that Benjamin wasn't his biological son? The thought was almost too painful to bear. Robert Clark had been a good man, honest and hard-working, the kind of father that any boy would be proud to call his own. If Blackwood's claims were true, then Robert had been even more remarkable than Benjamin had ever imagined, raising another man's child as his own without hesitation or resentment. "Hold steady now," Whitmore called from beneath his black cloth. "The exposure has begun." Benjamin forced himself to focus on the camera lens, trying to project an image of confidence and determination for posterity. He thought about the battles that lay ahead, the friends he would make among his fellow soldiers, the possibility that he might distinguish himself in combat and return home a hero. But even these optimistic thoughts were tinged with the dark shadow of Blackwood's revelations. The 30 seconds felt like an eternity. Benjamin's muscles began to ache from holding the prescribed position, and he found himself fighting the urge to blink or shift his weight. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the studio, and he wondered if the camera would capture this evidence of his nervousness. Finally, Whitmore emerged from behind his camera with a satisfied expression. "Excellent, Mr. Clark. I believe we've captured something quite special. The plate will need to be developed, but I'm confident that the results will please both you and your family." As Benjamin began changing back into his civilian clothes, Whitmore busied himself with the mysterious chemical processes that would transform the exposed plate into a permanent image. The photographer worked with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed these same operations hundreds of times, measuring chemicals and timing each step with scientific precision. "Will you be departing for the war soon?" Whitmore asked as he worked, his hands never pausing in their careful manipulations. "Tomorrow morning," Benjamin replied, folding his uniform carefully. "The regiment is assembling in Boston, and from there we'll be shipped south to wherever the fighting is thickest." Whitmore nodded gravely. "I've photographed many young men heading off to war over the past 2 years. Some have returned to purchase additional portraits, while others—" he paused delicately. "Well, their families have found comfort in having these final images to remember them by." The comment sent a chill down Benjamin's spine. He tried not to think about the possibility that this photograph might indeed be his final portrait, a frozen moment in time that would outlast his mortal flesh. Instead, he focused on the immediate future, on the journey to Boston and the beginning of his military service. As he prepared to leave the studio, Whitmore handed him a card with elegant script. "The portrait will be ready for collection tomorrow afternoon. I do hope you'll have the opportunity to retrieve it personally before your departure." Benjamin thanked the photographer and made his way back down the creaking stairs to the street below. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cobblestones and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He walked slowly through the town square, knowing that this might be his last peaceful evening in Millbrook for a very long time. His mother had prepared his favorite meal for supper, roast beef with potatoes and carrots from their small garden, followed by apple pie made from fruit they had preserved the previous autumn. The family ate in relative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the separation that would begin the following morning. After supper, Benjamin sat with Catherine on the front porch, wrapped in heavy coats against the evening chill. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, and the distant sound of a train whistle reminded them both of the journey that lay ahead. "I have something for you," Catherine said quietly, reaching into her coat pocket. She produced a small leather journal bound with a silk ribbon. "I thought you might want to write down your experiences so you can share them with us when you return." Benjamin accepted the journal with genuine gratitude, running his fingers over the smooth leather cover. "Thank you, Catherine. I promise I'll fill every page with stories that will make you laugh and cry and everything in between." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights come on in windows throughout the neighborhood. Each illuminated square represented a family, a collection of hopes and fears and dreams that Benjamin was leaving behind in service to a cause larger than himself. "Do you think the war will change you?" Catherine asked suddenly, her voice barely audible in the evening stillness. Benjamin considered the question carefully. He was already changing, had been changing, since the moment he received Blackwood's letter. The war might transform him further, but it wouldn't be the only factor shaping his future. "I hope it will make me a better man," he said finally. "More compassionate, more grateful for the things that really matter." That night, Benjamin lay in his narrow bed and listened to the familiar sounds of his childhood home. The old house creaked and settled around him, and he could hear his mother moving about in the kitchen below, probably unable to sleep for worry. He thought about Blackwood's letter, hidden beneath his mattress like a coiled snake waiting to strike. Should he tell his family the truth before leaving? Should he burden them with questions that might never be answered? In the end, he decided that some secrets were too dangerous to share. If he died in the war, there would be no point in destroying his family's happy memories with revelations that might prove to be lies. If he survived and managed to pay Blackwood's price, then he could decide what to do with whatever truth the merchant revealed. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting intricate patterns on the bedroom windows. Benjamin dressed carefully in his travel clothes and packed his few belongings into a canvas satchel. His mother had prepared a breakfast of eggs and bacon, but none of them had much appetite for food. The approaching separation hung over the meal like a dark cloud. As they prepared to leave for the train station, Benjamin remembered the photograph. "I need to collect my portrait from Whitmore's studio," he told his mother. "You said you wanted to have it as a keepsake." Margaret Clark's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "Yes, of course. We'll stop there on our way to the station." The walk to Whitmore's studio felt different in the morning light. The familiar streets of Millbrook seemed somehow foreign, as if Benjamin was already beginning his transformation from civilian to soldier. His boots clicked against the cobblestones with a rhythm that reminded him of marching, and he found himself unconsciously straightening his shoulders and lifting his chin. Whitmore was waiting for them with the finished daguerreotype, carefully mounted in an elegant frame of polished wood and brass. The image was remarkably clear, capturing every detail of Benjamin's uniform and every nuance of his expression. He looked confident and determined, a young man ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "One of my finest works," Whitmore declared proudly, as Margaret Clark examined the portrait with careful attention. The lighting was perfect, and Mr. Clark proved to be an excellent subject. This image should preserve beautifully for generations to come. Benjamin studied his own face in the photograph, surprised by how much older and more serious he appeared. The camera had captured something in his expression that he hadn't been aware of, a gravity that spoke of the weight he was carrying. His shadow fell across the floor behind him in the image, a dark silhouette that seemed to anchor him to the earth. They thanked Whitmore and made their way to the train station, where a small crowd had gathered to see Benjamin and 2 other local men off to war. The locomotive stood waiting like a great iron beast, steam rising from its smokestack and coal smoke staining the morning air. Benjamin embraced his mother and sister, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep, and accepting their tearful blessings. As the train pulled away from the station, Benjamin watched Millbrook shrink into the distance until it was nothing more than a collection of rooftops and church steeples on the horizon. He settled back in his seat and tried to focus on the future rather than the past, on the battles that lay ahead rather than the secrets he was leaving behind. The journey to Boston took most of the day, the train making frequent stops at small towns and farming communities along the way. Benjamin shared his car with other recruits from throughout Massachusetts, young men from all walks of life, united by their common destination and purpose. Some were eager for glory, while others seemed nervous about what lay ahead. Benjamin found himself somewhere in between, curious about the experiences that awaited him, but sobered by the knowledge that many of them would not survive to tell their stories. In Boston, he was processed through the military bureaucracy with efficient impersonality. He received additional equipment, underwent a brief medical examination, and was assigned to the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The paperwork reduced him to a series of numbers and classifications, stripping away his individuality in preparation for his transformation into a soldier. The next few weeks passed in a blur of training and preparation. Benjamin learned to march in formation, to load and fire his musket with mechanical precision, to follow orders without question or hesitation. He discovered muscles he had never known he possessed, and developed calluses in places that had never been hardened by labor. The physical transformation was accompanied by a mental one, as the individuality of civilian life gave way to the collective identity of military service. His fellow soldiers came from every corner of Massachusetts and beyond. There was Patrick O'Brien, a dock worker from Boston, whose Irish accent made him difficult to understand, but whose good humor kept spirits high during the most grueling training exercises. James Washington was a freed slave from New Bedford who could neither read nor write, but possessed an intuitive understanding of tactics that impressed their officers. David Steinberg had been a clerk in his father's dry goods store in Springfield, a quiet young man who wrote letters home every evening and kept a careful record of his expenses in a small notebook. Benjamin found himself drawn to these men in ways he had never expected. The shared hardships of military life created bonds that transcended the social barriers that would have separated them in civilian society. They looked out for one another, shared their rations during lean times, and told stories around the campfires that revealed their hopes and fears with remarkable honesty. As spring turned to summer, the regiment received orders to move south to join the main Union forces. They traveled by train and ship, passing through cities and landscapes that Benjamin had only read about in books. The journey was uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous, but it also opened his eyes to the vastness and diversity of the country he was fighting to preserve. The reality of war struck him during his first major engagement near Petersburg, Virginia. The Confederate forces were well entrenched, and the Union assault became a bloody disaster that left hundreds of men dead or wounded in the space of a few hours. Benjamin found himself crawling through mud made red with blood, his ears ringing from the constant thunder of artillery, his hands shaking as he tried to reload his musket while bullets whistled overhead. He saw Patrick O'Brien take a Confederate Minié ball in the chest, the impact spinning him around like a child's toy before he collapsed into the churned earth. James Washington lost his left arm to a piece of exploding shell, and David Steinberg simply vanished during the confusion of a nighttime retreat, his fate unknown and unknowable. The war stripped away Benjamin's romantic notions about military glory and revealed the brutal reality beneath the patriotic rhetoric. Men died in ways that were neither heroic nor meaningful, their lives snuffed out by random chance rather than acts of valor. The survivors carried on not because they were brave, but because they had no choice, because the alternative to fighting was desertion and shame. During quiet moments between battles, Benjamin wrote in the journal that Catherine had given him, trying to capture the experiences that words seemed inadequate to describe. He wrote about the sounds of battle, the smell of gunpowder and death, the way fear could make a man's bowels turn to water. He also wrote about the unexpected moments of beauty that could emerge even in the midst of horror. A sunset painting the sky crimson over a battlefield, the sound of someone playing a harmonica in the darkness, the simple pleasure of a hot meal after days of hardtack and cold coffee. As the months passed, Benjamin found himself changing in ways that went deeper than the obvious physical transformations. The naive young man who had posed for his portrait in Whitmore's studio was being replaced by someone harder and more pragmatic, someone who understood that survival often required compromises that his former self would have found unthinkable. He learned to sleep through artillery bombardments, to eat his rations without thinking about what might be crawling in them, to step over dead bodies as if they were fallen logs blocking a forest path. He developed a soldier's 1,000-yard stare, the distant expression that came from seeing too much death and suffering. His letters home became shorter and less frequent, not because he cared less about his family, but because the gulf between his experiences and their understanding seemed impossible to bridge with mere words. The war dragged on through 1864 and into 1865, each season bringing new campaigns and new casualties. Benjamin was promoted to corporal after showing leadership during a particularly difficult retreat, and later to sergeant when his company commander was killed by a sniper bullet. He found that he had a talent for keeping men alive, for making the kinds of tactical decisions that minimized losses while still accomplishing military objectives. By the spring of 1865, it was becoming clear that the Confederacy was collapsing. Union forces were advancing on multiple fronts, and the enemy's ability to resist was crumbling under the combined weight of superior numbers and resources. Benjamin's regiment participated in the final push toward Richmond, the Confederate capital, and he was present when the city finally fell to Union forces. The end came with surprising suddenness. One day they were fighting desperate battles against determined Confederate defenders, and the next they were marching through the streets of Richmond as conquering heroes. The war that had consumed so many lives and resources simply faded away, leaving behind a country that would need to rebuild itself from the ruins of conflict. Benjamin survived the war, but he was not the same man who had posed for his portrait in Millbrook 3 years earlier. The uniform that had once made him stand tall now felt like the costume of a character he no longer recognized. He had seen too much death, made too many difficult decisions, lost too many friends to ever return completely to the innocent young man he had been. As he prepared for demobilization and the journey home, Benjamin thought about Blackwood's letter, still hidden among his personal effects, like a time bomb waiting to explode. He had saved enough money from his military pay to meet the merchant's demands, but he was no longer sure he wanted to know the truth about his parentage. The war had taught him that some knowledge came at too high a price, that some secrets were better left buried. The train that carried him back to Massachusetts passed through landscapes that bore the scars of conflict. Burned buildings, abandoned farms, and overgrown cemeteries served as reminders of the war's terrible cost. Benjamin pressed his face to the window and watched these scenes of devastation scroll past, wondering what his own homecoming would bring. Millbrook looked smaller than he remembered, as if the war had somehow shrunk the world of his childhood. The familiar streets and buildings seemed almost toy-like after the vast scale of military campaigns and battlefields. His mother and Catherine were waiting at the train station, their faces lined with worry and anticipation. The reunion was both joyful and awkward. Benjamin embraced his family with genuine affection, but he could see the questions in their eyes, the attempts to reconcile the man who had returned with the boy who had left. He was thinner now, marked by visible scars and invisible wounds that would take years to heal. His hands shook sometimes, especially when he heard sudden loud noises, and he found it difficult to sleep through the night without nightmares. Margaret Clark had kept his portrait on the mantelpiece throughout his absence, and Benjamin was struck by the contrast between the confident young man in the photograph and the battle-weary veteran who now stood before it. The image seemed to mock him with its innocent optimism, its belief that war would be a grand adventure rather than a grinding ordeal of survival. As the weeks passed, Benjamin struggled to readjust to civilian life. The skills that had kept him alive during the war seemed useless in peacetime Millbrook. He found himself startled by children playing in the streets, mistaking their shouts for cries of alarm. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer reminded him too much of gunfire, and he avoided his father's old workshop. He tried to resume the life he had left behind, but it felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. His friends who had not served in the war seemed impossibly young and naive, concerned with trivial matters that struck him as meaningless after what he had witnessed. Those who had served understood him better, but they were often as damaged as he was, struggling with their own demons and seeking solace in alcohol or isolation. It was during this difficult period of adjustment that Benjamin finally decided to contact Harrison Blackwood. The merchant's letter had lost none of its power to disturb him, and the questions it raised seemed more urgent now that he had survived the war against all odds. He wrote to Blackwood, agreeing to meet and to pay the requested sum in exchange for the promised revelations. The meeting took place in a Boston hotel in a private dining room that spoke of wealth and discretion. Blackwood proved to be a thin, elegantly dressed man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He examined Benjamin with the attention of a jeweler appraising a precious stone, noting details that would have been invisible to a casual observer. "You have your father's eyes," Blackwood said without preamble, accepting the envelope of money that Benjamin offered, and his stubborn chin. "I knew Charles Peyton well before politics and scandal drove him into exile." The name meant nothing to Benjamin, but Blackwood's expression suggested that it should. The merchant opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a collection of documents, photographs, and letters that he spread across the table like a dealer arranging cards for an elaborate game. Charles Peyton was one of Massachusetts's most promising young politicians in the 1830s, Blackwood explained, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing a student. He served in the state legislature and seemed destined for higher office, perhaps even the governor's mansion. But he made the mistake of falling in love with a woman who was not his wife. Benjamin stared at a daguerreotype that showed a man bearing an unmistakable resemblance to his own features. The same dark eyes, the same strong jawline, even the same slightly crooked smile that Benjamin recognized from looking at his reflection in mirrors. "Your mother was very beautiful in those days," Blackwood continued, producing another photograph that showed a young woman who could only be Margaret Clark. She was perhaps 20 years younger, dressed in fine clothing that Benjamin had never seen her wear. Peyton was completely smitten, and she with him. Their affair lasted nearly 2 years before it became public knowledge. The scandal had destroyed Peyton's political career and nearly ruined his marriage. He had fled Massachusetts for California, where he had died in a mining accident just 5 years later, Margaret Clark had been left pregnant and disgraced, forced to rely on the kindness of Robert Clark, a man who had loved her silently for years and was willing to claim another man's child as his own. Your legal father was a remarkable man, Blackwood acknowledged. Not many men would have shown such generosity under the circumstances. He gave you his name and his love without reservation, and he never spoke of the truth to anyone, not even to you. Benjamin felt as if the world was shifting around him, as if the foundations of his identity were crumbling beneath his feet. Everything he had believed about himself, about his family, about his place in the world, had been built on carefully constructed lies. Robert Clark had indeed been his father, in every way that mattered, but not in the way that Benjamin had always assumed. "Why are you telling me this?" Benjamin asked, his voice barely steady. "What do you gain from destroying my peace of mind?" Blackwood's expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of genuine sympathy beneath his businesslike demeanor. "Because you have a right to know the truth about your origins, and because your biological father left behind a considerable inheritance that has been held in trust, waiting for his legitimate heirs to claim it. The inheritance was substantial property in California, investments in mining and railroad stocks, and cash holdings that totaled more than $50,000. It was enough money to transform Benjamin's life completely, to lift his family out of poverty and provide them with security for generations to come. But it came with a price that went beyond Blackwood's fee. Claiming the inheritance will require you to acknowledge your true parentage," Blackwood explained. "The legal documents will become part of the public record, and the scandal that destroyed your father's career will be revived. Your mother's reputation will be damaged, and your family will have to live with the consequences of decisions made before you were born." Benjamin stared at the documents spread across the table, trying to process the magnitude of what he was being offered. The money could solve all of his family's financial problems, but it would come at the cost of their social standing and their carefully preserved secrets. His mother would be revealed as an adulteress. Robert Clark's memory would be tainted by the revelation that he had been a cuckold, and Benjamin himself would be branded as a bastard. "I require time to consider," Benjamin stated at last, gathering up the photographs and documents Blackwood had presented to him. "This is not a choice I can make without serious reflection." Blackwood nodded with understanding. "Naturally, the inheritance has awaited this long. It can tolerate a further brief delay. However, do not tarry excessively, Mr. Clark. Or should I address you as Mr. Peaton? The legal proceedings implicated are intricate, and other prospective claimants might emerge should you postpone for too long." Benjamin returned to Millbrook with his thoughts in disarray. The photographs and documents lay concealed within his travel bag, like evidence pertaining to some dreadful transgression. He found himself observing his mother through a new lens, striving to reconcile the respectable widow she had become with the impassioned young woman who had once hazarded everything for love. He pondered whether she had ever lamented her decisions, if she had ever gazed upon him and perceived the countenance of Charles Peaton staring back at her. The decision monopolized his contemplations for weeks. He would lie awake throughout the nights, balancing the prospective advantages against the certain disadvantages, endeavoring to envision how his kin would respond to the disclosures. The funds would permit his mother to cease taking in laundry to manage financially, would secure for Catherine the proper education she merited, would grant each of them an opportunity for an improved existence. Yet it would simultaneously demolish the foundation of trust and respectability upon which their family had been constructed. As autumn arrived and the foliage commenced its transformation, Benjamin reached his conclusion. He composed a letter to Blackwood, declining to pursue the inheritance and petitioning for all documents concerning his parentage to be annihilated. The monetary sum, however considerable, was not worth the toll his family would be compelled to pay. Certain secrets, he resolved, were worth preserving, even at a profound personal expense. He incinerated Blackwood's initial letter and the photographs that very night, observing the flames devour the proof of his true lineage. The fire reduced Charles Peyton to cinders and smoke, expunging him from Benjamin's life as utterly as death had erased him from the world. Robert Clark would persist as his father in memory and in essence. The man who had molded his character and endowed him with the fortitude to make arduous choices. The portrait taken by Whitmore still occupied its honored position upon the mantelpiece, and Benjamin found himself examining it with newfound comprehension. The youth captured in the photograph had been brimming with queries regarding his identity, uncertain of his station in the world. The veteran who now stood before it had discovered his answers not in lineage and birth, but in the choices he had enacted and the principles he had embraced. Years elapsed, and Benjamin gradually found his niche within the post-war society. He married Catherine's closest companion, a kind young woman named Elizabeth, who comprehended his quietudes and aided him in healing from his war injuries. They had children together, and Benjamin found that fatherhood felt instinctive to him, perhaps because he had been fortunate to have such superb exemplars of what it signified to be a father. He never spoke to anyone regarding Blackwood's revelations, bearing the secret as his personal burden rather than distributing it among his family. His mother lived to be 78, never learning that her meticulously guarded secret had been uncovered and then consciously consigned to oblivion. Catherine married a teacher from Springfield and raised 4 children of her own, never discovering that the brother she adored was merely her half-brother. Benjamin lived to be 73 years of age, sufficiently long to witness the nation convalesce from the injuries of civil war and to observe his own children mature into adults. Upon his deathbed, encircled by family and companions, he reflected upon the choice he had made all those years prior. The $50,000 would have rendered many things less difficult, but it would not have rendered them superior. The affection of a good father, whether biological or chosen, possessed greater value than any bequest. His portrait was handed down through successive generations of the Clark family, a memento of a young man's courage and the forfeits made by an entire generation. For more than a century, it was displayed in various family residences, gathering the patina of age, yet forfeiting none of its capacity to evoke recollections of a less complicated era when right and wrong seemed more distinctly delineated. It was not until 2008 that the portrait captured the notice of professional historians. Benjamin's great-great-grandson, investigating his family history for a genealogical endeavor, donated the daguerreotype to the Smithsonian Institution, along with several other familial artifacts. The museum's specialists were intrigued by the portrait primarily as an exemplar of Civil War-era photography, representative of the multitude of similar images captured before young men departed for combat. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a specialist in 19th century photography, was the first to detect something peculiar about the picture. While cataloging the portrait for the museum's collection, she noted that the shadow cast by Benjamin's figure appeared inconsistent with his posture and the illumination conditions in Whitmore's studio. The irregularity was subtle, discernible only when the image was scrutinized under significant magnification, but it was unequivocally present. "Shadows do not deceive," Dr. Martinez clarified to her colleagues during a staff assembly. "They are generated by the interplay of light and form, and they adhere to predictable physical statutes. But this particular shadow does not correspond to the subject's actual stance." The discovery prompted an exhaustive analysis utilizing digital enhancement technology that had been unavailable to prior generations of investigators. When the image was processed through sophisticated computer programs engineered to unveil concealed details, the shadow divulged its terrifying mystery. Instead of depicting Benjamin Clark standing resolutely in his uniform, the enhanced shadow portrayed the unmistakable silhouette of a human figure suspended from a rope. The body was contorted at an unnatural angle that could only signify death by hanging. The revelation dispatched shockwaves through the historical community. Dr. Martinez assembled a team of authorities from various disciplines to inspect the photograph and endeavor to elucidate the impossible anomaly. Physicists scrutinized the lighting parameters. Photography specialists dissected the daguerreotype methodology, and historians delved into Benjamin Clark's military service record with unprecedented meticulousness. "We have inspected every facet of this image," Dr. Martinez declared during a press conference that attracted national media consideration. The photograph itself is authentic, dating from 1863, based on the chemical constitution of the photographic plate and the fashion of the uniform. There is no indication of tampering or double exposure, techniques that would have been immensely challenging to accomplish with the daguerreotype process of that period. The enigma intensified when researchers unearthed Benjamin Clark's complete military records in the National Archives. Contrary to what his shadow seemed to prognosticate, Benjamin had not perished by hanging during the Civil War. In actuality, he had served with distinction, surviving countless engagements and returning home safely in 1865. He had lived for decades following the war, married, raised offspring, and died peacefully in his own bed in 1906. Every document we have located confirms that Benjamin Clark lived a long and productive life after the war, elaborated Dr. Robert Chen, a historian focusing on Civil War military archives. He was promoted to sergeant, was awarded commendations for valor, and was present at the surrender of Confederate forces in Virginia. There is absolutely no intimation that he ever confronted execution by hanging or came proximate to such a destiny. The impossible character of the shadow's prophecy merely augmented the mystery's allure. News outlets globally disseminated the story, and the Smithsonian found itself inundated with visitors eager to view the photograph personally. The museum was compelled to implement special protective measures to safeguard the fragile daguerreotype from the crowds of inquisitive spectators who arrived to behold what many were dubbing the most haunting enigma in American history. Amateur sleuths and conspiracy theorists proffered dozens of elucidations for the anomalous shadow. Some postulated that Benjamin Clark had possessed psychic faculties that permitted his shadow to disclose his ultimate fate, despite that fate never actually materializing. Others proposed that the photograph had somehow captured a depiction from an alternate chronology, a parallel universe where Benjamin's narrative had concluded quite differently. Religious factions seized upon the image as verification of divine intercession or supernatural occurrences. Several televangelists asserted that the shadow represented a spiritual admonition, a glimpse into the destiny that would have awaited Benjamin had he not discovered redemption through military duty. New Age practitioners suggested that the photograph had captured Benjamin's shadow self, the darker facets of his personality that he had successfully surmounted through his war ordeals. Scientists remained skeptical of these supernatural interpretations, but they struggled to furnish a rational alternative. The statutes of physics appeared to propose no mechanism by which a shadow could depict something other than the object casting it. The daguerreotype procedure, while complex, was thoroughly comprehended, and experts could locate no technical rationale for how such an anomaly could have transpired. Dr. Martinez and her team dedicated months to examining comparable photographs from the same epoch, hoping to discover other instances of impossible shadows or unexplained irregularities. They analyzed thousands of Civil War portraits housed in museums and private collections across the nation. But Benjamin Clark's photograph remained singular. Whatever had induced his shadow to deviate from reality appeared to be a unique occurrence, impossible to replicate or clarify. The investigation took an unforeseen turn when researchers decided to inspect Marcus Whitmore's other photographic output from the same period. The photographer's studio logs had been conserved by his descendants, furnishing a meticulous chronicle of his clientele and their portraits during the Civil War years. What they discovered superimposed another stratum of mystery upon an already incomprehensible puzzle. Whitmore had photographed 17 other young men departing for military duty. Within the same week, he had created Benjamin Clark's portrait. Of those 17 individuals, 12 had died durante the war, most in battle, but some from illness or mishap. The mortality rate amid Whitmore's subjects was actually superior to the average for Massachusetts regiments, a grim coincidence that might have been ascribed to the random essence of warfare. But there was one particular that chilled the researchers to the marrow. Of the 12 men who had perished, 3 had been executed by hanging for desertion or other martial offenses. Their shadows in Whitmore's photographs appeared perfectly ordinary, displaying no suggestion of their eventual destiny. Only Benjamin Clark's shadow had disclosed a death that never came to pass, a prophecy that remained unfulfilled. The discovery stimulated a renewed inquiry into Benjamin's life and military service. Historians combed through regimental documents, personal correspondences, and contemporary newspaper reports, scouring for any indication that he might have confronted charges that could have resulted in execution. They found allusions to his promotions and commendations, testimonials to his bravery and leadership, but nothing that insinuated he had ever been in jeopardy of facing a military tribunal. Dr. Martinez's team also attempted to trace Benjamin's family ancestry, hoping to find some clue that might explicate the shadow's ominous message. They uncovered the narrative of his parents' marriage, Robert Clark's magnanimity in raising another man's child, and the family's struggles during the post-war years. But nothing in the historical documentation suggested any linkage to the dark fate depicted in his shadow. The investigation might have persisted interminably if not for a fortuitous discovery made by Benjamin's great-great-great-granddaughter, Rebecca Clark Morrison, a retired librarian from Oregon who had been keenly tracking the story in the news. While tidying her late mother's attic, she discovered a trunk containing Benjamin's personal effects from his military tenure, including the leather journal his sister Catherine had gifted him before his departure for the war. The journal encompassed Benjamin's own narrative of his martial experiences, inscribed in his meticulous handwriting during tranquil intervals between conflicts. The majority of the entries addressed the routine hardships of Army existence, descriptions of marches and encampments, observations concerning his fellow soldiers, and meditations on the character of war and courage. But one entry dated December 15th, 1864, stood apart from the remainder. "Today I came nearer to death than I have since the war commenced," Benjamin had written, his typically steady penmanship betraying indications of agitation. Not from enemy projectiles or cannon fire, but from the merciless justice of military law. A soldier from our company, Private Davidson, was apprehended deserting his post durante last night's skirmish. The court-martial was expeditious, and the sentence was death by hanging. I was selected to serve on the firing squad designated to carry out the execution, but at the final instant, Colonel Williams determined that hanging would function as a superior deterrent to other potential deserters. The entry proceeded with a description of the execution, conducted at dawn in a clearing adjacent to the regiment's winter encampment. Benjamin had been commanded to assist in constructing the gallows, a grim undertaking that had filled him with revulsion and dread. Nevertheless, as the moment of execution approached, an unanticipated development altered everything. Just as the noose was positioned around Davidson's neck, a Confederate raiding party assaulted our camp, Benjamin had written. The hanging was postponed, as every available soldier was summoned to repel the incursion. Durante the engagement, Davidson managed to escape from his guards and vanished into the woodland. He was never recaptured, and the colonel concluded that pursuing him would be an inefficient use of valuable resources. The entry culminated with a reflection that sent chills along Rebecca Morrison's spine as she perused it over a century and a half later. I assisted in building that gallows, and for a moment I stood where Davidson would have stood, examining the rope and the mechanism that would have terminated his life. As I stood there with the noose around my own neck, even in jest, I felt as though death itself was measuring me for a shroud. The sensation was so vivid that I found myself speculating whether somehow, in some other realm or time, it might be my own neck in that noose instead of Davidson's. The journal entry supplied a rational explanation for the shadow's impossible prophecy. Benjamin Clark had indeed stood with a noose around his neck, if only fleetingly, and in preparation for the execution of another man. Somehow, the daguerreotype had captured not his actual shadow at the moment of exposure, but the shadow of his most profound fear, the image of the fate he had narrowly avoided. Yet this explanation raised just as many questions as it managed to answer. How could a photographic process capture an image from the subject's memory or imagination, rather than his physical reality? The daguerreotype was a chemical procedure dependent on the interaction of light and silver compounds, not on the thoughts or feelings of the person being photographed. There existed no known mechanism through which Benjamin's psychological condition could have influenced the physical attributes of his shadow. Martinez and her team contemplated various possibilities. Perhaps Benjamin had subconsciously assumed a posture reminiscent of his traumatic ordeal while posing for the portrait. Perhaps the strain of his imminent departure for war had caused him to relive the moment of standing upon the gallows, generating a kind of psychosomatic effect that had somehow impacted the photographic procedure. But these justifications appeared insufficient to account for the precision and detail of the shadow's prophecy. The silhouette displayed not merely a hanging figure, but specific details of posture and positioning that corresponded precisely to Benjamin's description of the gallows he had helped to construct. It was as though the photograph had somehow reached into his memory and extracted the most traumatic instant of his military service. This mystery attracted the consideration of researchers from fields far removed from history and photography. Quantum physicists speculated about the possibility that consciousness could influence physical reality in ways science had not yet uncovered. Psychologists examined the case as an instance of how traumatic memories might manifest in unforeseen manners. Paranormal investigators perceived it as evidence of psychic phenomena, challenging the conventional comprehension of the relationship between mind and matter. None of these authorities could furnish a definitive explanation for the impossible shadow. The photograph remained an enigma, a window into a mystery that seemed to exist at the intersection of science and the supernatural. The Smithsonian eventually established a permanent exhibit centered on the portrait, presenting it as an unresolved puzzle that continues to challenge both scholars and visitors alike. The narrative of Benjamin Clark's prophetic shadow became incorporated into American folklore, inspiring books, documentaries, and countless theories concerning the nature of time, consciousness, and reality itself. Some individuals viewed it as proof that the future was predetermined, that fate could cast its shadow backward through time to warn of dangers lying ahead. Others interpreted it as evidence that the past and future were more deeply interconnected than science had previously acknowledged. For Rebecca Morrison, her ancestor's story served as a reminder of the intricacy and mystery concealed within every family history. She donated the journal to the Smithsonian, where it was displayed alongside the portrait as part of the ongoing investigation. These two artifacts together narrated a tale that was simultaneously deeply personal and universally mysterious. A chronicle of one man's brush with destiny and the shadow that somehow knew what was approaching. The mystery might have remained perpetually unsolved were it not for a breakthrough originating from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist investigating the relationship between memory and perception, became intrigued by Benjamin's case while researching how traumatic experiences could influence sensory data processing. Her work with military veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress had revealed that the brain occasionally processes traumatic memories as if they were present reality, creating vivid flashbacks that feel more authentic than actual experiences of the current moment. Dr. Vasquez proposed that Benjamin Clark had undergone what she termed a temporal displacement event while posing for his portrait. The stress of his impending deployment to war, combined with his subconscious recollections of the near execution, had generated a psychological state wherein his traumatic memory temporarily became more vivid and real than his actual physical position in Whitmore's studio. The human brain does not always clearly distinguish between remembered experiences and present reality, Dr. Vasquez explained during a lecture at Harvard Medical School. Under conditions of extreme duress, traumatic memories can intrude upon present awareness with such intensity that they temporarily override normal sensory input. It is conceivable that Benjamin Clark's mind was so intensely focused on his memory of standing on the gallows that this recollection somehow influenced the photographic process. Her theory suggested that consciousness might interact with physical reality in ways that science is only beginning to grasp. If thoughts and memories could influence matter at the quantum level, perhaps Benjamin's intense psychological state had somehow affected the silver compounds on Whitmore's photographic plate, creating an image that reflected his inner reality rather than his external appearance. The theory remained speculative, but it offered the most plausible explanation for an otherwise impossible phenomenon. Other researchers commenced investigations into similar cases, searching for instances where powerful emotional states or traumatic memories might have influenced photographic images. They discovered a few isolated examples of anomalous shadows or unexplained figures in old photographs, but none as dramatic or thoroughly documented as Benjamin Clark's prophetic portrait. As the years passed, the mystery of the impossible shadow evolved into a touchstone for discussions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, and the possibility that reality is far more complex and interconnected than everyday experience suggests. The photograph served as a reminder that even in an age of scientific rationalism, phenomena remain that challenge human comprehension and defy straightforward explanation. Benjamin Clark himself would likely have been amused by the attention his portrait received more than a century after his death. He had been a pragmatic man, shaped by the harsh realities of war and the necessities of survival. He had confronted his fears, made difficult choices, and lived his life according to principles of honor and compassion, learned from the man he had always considered his true father. The shadow that had somehow predicted a death that never came might have been a manifestation of his deepest anxieties, a glimpse into an alternate timeline, or simply an inexplicable anomaly that would forever remain beyond human understanding. But for Benjamin, the crucial element had not been the mystery of his shadow, but the choices he had made in the light. His portrait continued to hang in the Smithsonian, drawing thousands of visitors annually who came to see the impossible shadow and ponder its significance. Some viewed it as a ghost story, others as a scientific puzzle, and still others as a meditation on the nature of fate and free will. Yet perhaps the most fitting interpretation was the simplest. It was the portrait of a young man who had faced the possibility of death and had chosen to live, who had confronted his fears and had found the courage to move forward despite them. The shadow would forever remain a mystery, but the man who cast it had been entirely real. Benjamin Clark had lived and loved, served his country and raised his children, and passed on to future generations the values and virtues that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his life. His impossible shadow might have predicted death, but his actual life had been a testament to the power of hope, courage, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Ultimately, the most remarkable aspect of Benjamin Clark's photograph was not the mystery of its prophetic shadow, but the story of the man himself, a young soldier who had faced the unknown with determination and had found his way home to the people he loved. The shadow might have depicted death, but the man had chosen life, and that choice had echoed through the generations, inspiring others to face their own fears with similar courage and resolve. The mystery of the impossible shadow would continue to perplex researchers and fascinate the public for years to come. But Benjamin Clark's true legacy was not the enigma of his portrait, but the example of his life. He had been a good son, a brave soldier, and a loving father, and those qualities had proven far more enduring than any photographic anomaly. The shadow had predicted death, but the man had achieved something far more valuable. He had lived a life worth remembering. The National Science Foundation awarded a research grant to study the photograph and similar anomalous images, hoping to identify previously unknown aspects of photographic chemistry or quantum mechanics that might account for such impossibilities. The research team, led by Dr. Maria Santos from MIT, conducted extensive experiments attempting to recreate conditions that might yield comparable shadow anomalies. They photographed subjects experiencing various forms of psychological stress, exposed photographic plates to different types of electromagnetic radiation, and even attempted to utilize meditation and visualization techniques to influence photographic outcomes. Despite months of meticulous experimentation, they proved unable to replicate Benjamin's impossible shadow. "We have explored every conventional explanation we can conceive of," Dr. Santos reported to the NSF Review Committee. "The phenomenon appears to be singular, possibly the consequence of a unique confluence of factors that occurred only once in photographic history. We may be observing evidence of previously unknown interactions between consciousness and matter, or we may simply be witnessing an extraordinarily rare quantum event that defies statistical probability." The failure to replicate the phenomenon only amplified its significance within the scientific community. Researchers commenced investigating other historical photographs with renewed vigilance, searching for similar anomalies that might have been overlooked or dismissed as imperfections. They uncovered a handful of images containing unexplained elements, shadows that did not quite align with their subjects, or figures that materialized in supposedly vacant spaces. One particularly compelling discovery was made within the archives of the Library of Congress, where researchers found a Civil War-era photograph of a soldier group that contained what appeared to be the specter of a fallen comrade standing among them. Unlike Benjamin's shadow, this figure was clearly visible to casual observation. Yet military records confirmed that the ghostly soldier had perished in battle 3 days before the photograph was taken. These discoveries suggested that Benjamin's portrait might not be entirely unique, but rather part of a previously unrecognized category of anomalous historical photographs. The researchers began developing protocols for identifying and studying such images, hoping to detect patterns that might reveal the underlying mechanisms responsible for these impossible captures. The international attention surrounding Benjamin's photograph also inspired amateur investigators to scour their own family collections for unusual images. Thousands of photographs were submitted to the Smithsonian for analysis, though the majority proved to be instances of conventional photographic flaws or pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random visual information. However, a few submitted photographs exhibited genuine anomalies that defied straightforward explanation. A family in Ireland possessed a 19th-century portrait of their ancestor, wherein his reflection in a mirror displayed a completely different facial expression than the subject himself. A collector in Japan owned a photograph of a geisha that depicted her shadow dancing even though the woman herself stood perfectly motionless. These discoveries hinted that anomalous photography might have been more prevalent during the early days of the medium than previously acknowledged. Perhaps the primitive chemistry and prolonged exposure times of early photographic processes had temporarily rendered cameras sensitive to phenomena that modern equipment could no longer detect. Dr. Martinez established an international database of anomalous historical photographs, cataloging each image and its provenance, in hopes of identifying common factors that might explain their impossible characteristics. The database expanded to include over 300 authenticated images from around the globe, spanning the period from photography's invention in the 1830s through the early 20th century. Analysis of the database revealed several intriguing patterns. Anomalous photographs were most common during eras of social upheaval, particularly wars, epidemics, and natural disasters. They were more likely to be found in photographs of individuals undergoing major life transitions such as marriage, military service, or immigration, and they appeared to be most frequent in images created by photographers who had expressed interest in spiritualism or the supernatural. These patterns suggested that anomalous photography might be connected to heightened emotional states or psychological stress, supporting Dr. Vasquez's theory regarding the interaction between consciousness and physical reality. The database became an invaluable resource for researchers studying the intersection of psychology, physics, and photographic chemistry. Benjamin Clark's impossible shadow had evolved from a single mysterious image into the centerpiece of a new field of scientific inquiry. Universities began offering courses on anomalous photography, and scholarly journals published papers on the quantum mechanics of consciousness and its potential effects on matter. The photograph that had once been merely a family keepsake had become a catalyst for expanding humanity's comprehension of reality itself. As the investigation continued into its second decade, new technologies provided additional tools for analyzing Benjamin's portrait. Quantum computers were employed to model potential interactions between consciousness and photographic chemistry, while advances in brain imaging enabled researchers to study the neural correlates of traumatic memory formation. Each new analytical technique uncovered additional layers of complexity within the mystery. The portrait's fame also inspired artists and writers to create works exploring themes of fate, prophecy, and the relationship between past and future. A Broadway musical titled Shadows of Time recounted Benjamin's story through song and dance, while a best-selling novel imagined a world where prophetic photographs were commonplace and their subjects lived in dread of their predicted fates. Benjamin Clark himself had become a symbol of resilience and courage when confronted with an uncertain future. Schools taught his story as an example of how individuals could overcome adversity and choose their own destinies despite seemingly insurmountable challenges. His portrait served as a reminder that the future was not fixed, that even the darkest prophecies could be overcome through determination and moral courage. The mystery of his impossible shadow continued to inspire new generations of researchers and investigators, each bringing fresh perspectives and innovative approaches to the puzzle. Some focused on the psychological aspects of the phenomenon, while others explored its implications for our understanding of time and causality. Still others perceived it as evidence of dimensions of reality that science had not yet learned to perceive or measure. Rebecca Morrison, now in her 80s, continued to serve as the keeper of her family's story and the guardian of Benjamin's legacy. She authored a memoir about her experience of discovering the journal and witnessing her ancestors' ascent to international fame, donating the proceeds to fund continued research into anomalous photography. Benjamin never sought fame or recognition, she wrote in the memoir's conclusion. He was simply a young man endeavoring to fulfill his duty and find his place in the world. The fact that his portrait has inspired so much scientific investigation and philosophical reflection would likely surprise him, but I believe he would be gratified to know that his story continues to help people grapple with life's most profound mysteries. The photograph remained on display at the Smithsonian, where it continued to attract visitors from across the world. Each person who stood before it brought their own questions and interpretations, adding to the rich tapestry of meaning that had grown around Benjamin's impossible shadow. The mystery might never be fully resolved, but its capacity to inspire wonder, curiosity, and contemplation appeared limitless. In the end, perhaps that was Benjamin Clark's greatest legacy, not the solution to his portrait's mystery, but the questions it raised about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human potential. His impossible shadow had become a window into the unknown, a reminder that even in an age of scientific certainty, mysteries remained that challenged human understanding and invited continued exploration. The young soldier, who had once stood anxiously in Marcus Whitmore's studio, troubled about his future and burdened by family secrets, had achieved a form of immortality he could never have envisioned. His story would continue to inspire researchers, artists, and philosophers for generations to come, ensuring that the mystery of his prophetic shadow would never be forgotten.